Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with what is going to be the final video in a bit of a series I've been doing for quite a while now, and essentially making these periodic top 10 players of all time videos for specific points in Survivor history, to where, again, I've kind of been documenting how my top 10 lists would have progressed over time, where I've done a top 10 player video for before Survivor All-Stars, I did one for after Micronesia, after Heroes vs. Villains, before Cambodia, and now we're at the point where we're essentially catching up with Survivor history, where I actually did my proper top 10 players of all time video after Survivor Winners at War. Obviously a very defining season for that list, the season where it really solidified the people at the top, with us getting to see a lot of the best players of all time play again. So where again, this list will be the final step towards that video. This will be a video where I rank the top 10 players as it was right before Survivor Winners at War. It's where obviously since the last time I did the video, again, that would be nearly 10 seasons of the show, going from Cambodia all the way to IOI. So straight up, there are not many changes in that time. Yeah, again, I do feel like this video is still worth making as this final step for getting caught up to what ended up being the final list. So with that, again, we'll eventually be talking about what my top 10 was at this time. But before we get to that, I do want to talk about some honorable mentions. So again, we'll be running through the players that played in between the times of this and the last video. So between 31 and 39, talking about the people I had in consideration. Though first, we're actually going to be talking about 3 people that were on the original list that are now not on the list. Meaning that, again, there are only 3 new people on the list proper. 3 people ended up getting kicked out. The first of which being the person that was at number 10 on the previous list. So again, not a shocker that person got kicked out over time. That person is Tyson Apostle, who again, in this time frame, we did not see him play again. And really, I think at the time of when that last list would have been made, which again is right before Cambodia, I think that would have been my peak on my opinions of Tyson as a player. Or while I did have very high hopes for Tyson coming into Winners at War, and again, still looked at him pretty highly, I do think the overall luster of Tyson kind of faded a bit, to where again, immediately after Brothers of Water, I was very high on Tyson. I did very much look at him as someone that is, again, transforming into this truly elite Survivor player, someone that kind of had all the skills necessary for the game. Sure, while again, his runs on his individual seasons were a bit too inconsistent to really rank him much higher on the list, again, he is someone that I definitely saw a lot of potential from, to where I think, again, as time went on, again, my opinion of that started to fade a bit, to where, again, that opinion didn't hold as much, though, again, Tyson's still someone I held in pretty high regard at this point. Or again, I even declared him as the person I thought was the most likely to win in my preseason power ranking for Winners at War, to where, again, I did have a lot of faith in Tyson still at this point, but again, not enough to be in the top 10. Another player that, again, was in the top 10 that got kicked off over time is, again, unshockingly, the number 9 person on my previous list, which was Natalie Anderson. It's another thing here where, again, it's just seasons have passed. My opinion on her hadn't really changed, just that there's other people that got added to the list, and even then, again, I think Natalie would have been extremely close to making it on. Straight up, I think Natalie is probably number 11 at this current point. I think she is essentially fighting for a number 10 spot with a certain person that made it on, to where I think I would have picked that person just because I think they came off as a more well-rounded player across their season than Natalie, where again, I think with Natalie, I always have that qualm at the fact that obviously she gets blindsided the Jeremy vote, but even beyond that, it's a situation where she was willing to take Jeremy to the end, in a spot where she probably would have lost to him, in a spot where, again, Jeremy was looked at as the biggest jury threat on the board, yet she was still willing to go to the end with him, which, again, to be fair, the number 10 person on my list has a similar-ish issue, yet though I think it's slightly different there, and I think that person probably had less choice in it, to where I think Natalie would have done this unpromptedly. So I think that lack of killer instinct against her number 1 ally, even in a spot where she thought she would lose to him, is again something that is enough to knock her out of the top 10 right now. And the other person is someone that just genuinely would have gone down since the last list, someone that again I would have had in pretty high regard up to his most recent appearance, but in this time frame again, he played again, he had a bad run. It would have been enough to knock him out, and that person is JT Thomas, who, again, I think after Heroes vs. Villains, while a lot of people definitely criticize Heroes vs. Villains run, I'm someone that still supported JT. I think JT was still a very solid player. After that, again, he made a mistake, but it's not anything that is extremely detrimental to his overall legacy in my mind. It's something that, again, I think is a move that, if it worked, it would have been this game-winning move for him, to where, again, I think there's ups and downs with that move. However, I think when we get to Game Changers, I think that makes it a bit tougher to assess JT, to where, again, I still think at the end of the day, JT was screwed over by the swap. Again, he was put in this spot where he was the only person from his original tribe and was essentially a dead man walking, though, again, he found an idol. He had a chance to save himself and still gets tricked and not playing his idol, which is not good. Even outside that, JT does play pretty sloppily once he's on the bottom anyway, to where there's definitely qualms to be had there. I think my opinion of JT would have gone down enough to where I think I probably would have him below both Natalie and Tyson at this specific point, where again, by this point, I don't think he would have been that close to actually making the top 10. But now let's again run through the rest of the honorable mentions, people that played from the times of Survivor Cambodia to the time of IOI. So let's start off with Survivor Cambodia, which, I mean, shockingly, despite the fact Cambodia is obviously this season that's known for like evolving the strategy of the game, I feel like it's also a season that my opinion of many players didn't really go up through the time of Cambodia, where, I mean, I think there's a decent amount that kind of stayed the same. I think there's someone like a Steven Fishback, where, again, just kind of gave us a little bit more proof to things, but didn't really knock him up or down really in any significant way. I think the people that would have had more major changes, though, are Tasha, who is someone that obviously gets to the very end of the game, though also had no real win equity, but still, her navigation through this game was very impressive, especially considering the fact that she was essentially swap screwing, the fact that she was able to turn that around to her running that tribe. Again, I think it's impressive when it's mixing that in with her Kagyan game, which obviously has some ups and downs, but still some impressive stuff there as well, where, again, I think Tasha's a competent player definitely by this point, but not really that close to making top 10, and the same thing goes to Spencer as well. For a while, Spencer, again, had a very rocky Kagyan run, he at least was essentially 2 challenges away from winning the game, to where when we're looking at him in Cambodia, again, his win equity is obviously a lot less, but I think his navigation through the game is still very impressive. Again, he ends up actually being in a no throughout the entire post-merge phase of the game, something that even the winner of this season cannot say. Also facing a lot of adversity early on, and him playing from the bottom, and again, I think there's a lot to like from Spencer on this season. I think through this season, he definitely becomes one of the better players to never win, though again, still not really in contention for the actual top 10, which again is primarily filled with winners of the game. There's only one non-winner in the top 10, so again, it's tough to really squeeze Spencer in that spot. Next for Ko Wrong, and the main consideration here would have obviously been Michelle, who won the season, though considering the fact that her win is not particularly great and she hasn't come back for Winners at War yet, where I think her legacy goes up after that season, even though again still not that much. It's again not enough to be top 10. Really, I don't think Michelle would have ever been that close to my personal top 10 even after Winners at War, to where again, while she is a winner, and again there definitely are things to praise from her game, it's not enough to be in the top 10 here. Similar thing with Adam and Malaysia Gen X, where again he won the season, played a competent enough game, but one that is again just kind of messy enough to where I would not look at him as a consistent player coming into Winners at War, and didn't really have the highest hopes for him coming into Winners at War, to where, again, I do not look at him that highly, where, again, he wasn't particularly close to making the list. Next for Game Changers, where, again, there's some people whose legacies changed a bit. I mean, Ty is someone that obviously played twice over the course of this time frame, and through that, again, got to the final tribal once and got to the final 4. His next appearance, again, it's a very impressive run. It's one where, again, there's a lot to like here from Ty, but again, it's just not enough to be in the top 10, especially without a win here. And I mean, to be honest, it's probably even lower than the likes of Spencer and Tasha anyway, to where, again, not that close to making the top 10. Also mentioned Brad Culpepper, who obviously has his second run here and him getting to the very end in a spot where he comes somewhat close to winning, though even then, again, turned away certain jury members and had the win out at the end, so again, not enough to make it onto the proper list. Though I think someone that I did kind of expect to be in the running that did not make the top 10 was Sarah Lucina, where obviously after Winners at War, Sarah Lucina does solidify her spot in my top 10. She is someone that plays a very impressive game on Game Changers. Yeah, I do think after Game Changers, I still don't feel like there was enough there to be a top 10 player. She would be in the ballpark. I think she would be, again, hovering around the top 15 or so. Yeah, I do think she's a player that I would definitely qualm with her overall tactics, particularly in how she managed the jury, where the jury was pretty bitter at her. They did not really want her to win, yet a good chunk of the jury just felt like she played the more impressive game and felt like they needed to award that in a spot where that's not necessarily the criteria in many situations. I do think there are many seasons where if Sarah plays the way she does, the jury is just going to vote against her, where I think seeing that specifically on this season would have deterred me away from putting her as the top 10 player at this current point, especially without, again, the Winners at War run involved in that, where, again, she's in the dominant alliance once again. So, again, through that, that would obviously be enough to really put her towards the top of the list, but I think without that, I think I would have some question marks here to leave her out of the top 10. Now for HHH, where, again, for non-winners, I mean, you do have the likes of Devin, who is someone that was very much screwed over, but I think having a one-time non-winner at this point, again, it's just not going to be enough to crack the top 10, even though, again, I think there is some good to be had from Devin, but again, not top 10 material. Chrissy is another person. Again, there are things to praise from Chrissy, obviously. Definitely gets screwed over by Ben getting to the end. Yeah, again, not really enough to crack the top 10, and again, Ben is someone to mention here in the fact that he at least won. Again, it's not an overly impressive win, but I think there's some good, there's some bad, but again, not enough to crack the top 10 either. From Ghost Island, the only consideration here to not make the list would be Dominic, and Dominic obviously is the closest anyone has gone to winning a season without winning, and through that, again, Dominic would definitely be in the conversation here. Again, don't think he makes the top 10. I do think he probably makes the top 20-ish at this point. I'm definitely the best one-time non-winning player, and again, amongst the best non-winning players as well, but I do feel like he still showed some, again, not great jury management at points, and him having a gameplay style that does seem a bit inconsistent, where we do see him being in a bit of danger early on, where, again, I do think there is some rockiness there to keep him out of the top 10. Next up for David versus Goliath, again, I think Mike White is someone to take into consideration here, but again, as I mentioned with previous players, again, him being a non-winner, it makes it tough for him to actually make the top 10, but I think Mike actually very much surprised me in how good of a player he was on that season, where, and while we do see some talk early on about him not really gelling with the group, I think he ended up being a very good social player and really ran a lot of that season, where, again, he would be in the conversation, but again, not enough to be top 10. And obviously, as it goes with the winner of this season and Nick Wilson, again, I think there would be a conversation, as I was actually pretty high on Nick as a player after David vs. Goliath, where while obviously he is on the outs at points, I do think the fact that he was still able to get into a spot where he was never truly in danger, even though he did win those final few immunities, I think it's somewhat impressive. Though I think the thing that's keeping out of the top 10 for me is the way he handles being on the bottom, where, again, when we see him being blindsided at a vote, we then see him to proceed to pout and just be pissed at the other players in a way that, again, just seems to be deterring people from being willing to work with him, to where while they do eventually do work with him, I feel like it's something that isn't going to be effective on most given cases, to where I don't think he plays those situations particularly well. Where outside that, again, I think he's a pretty well-rounded player. He obviously wins challenges when he needs to. He, again, seemed to be pretty affable to most of the cast, and again, played a pretty decent strategic game at points as well. Where, again, the John Hennigan move was his idea, which I think is one of the most impressive individual plays in Modern Survivor. Where, again, I think there's a lot to like from Nick, and I think if it were not for the fact that he handled being on the bottom so poorly, I probably would have him much closer to being in contention for the top 10, but again, at the end of the day, did not crack it. Next for Edge of Extinction, where no newbie player was really in contention for this list, and shockingly not Chris Underwood, but I did consider some of the returning players, where obviously all these people played multiple times in this time frame, where Kelly Wentworth, obviously this was her third appearance, she had played 2 times now, with her playing on Second Chance, and now in Edge of Extinction, both pretty solid appearances, obviously getting to the Final Four and almost winning in Cambodia, and this appearance, while getting taken out much earlier, I think demonstrated more control in the game, which I think is impressive. Where, again, I think Kelly Wentworth is a very solid player, again, amongst the best non-winning players, but again, I think it's very tough for her to crack the top 10. Same thing goes with Aubrey, who obviously plays 3 times up to this point, 3 times in this specific time frame, which is pretty insane. Again, having a runner-up appearance, and Ko Rong getting towards the end game despite being on the bottom and having a massive target on her back, and Game Changers, which is somewhat impressive. And again, she would definitely be in the conversation to crack the top 10 before Edge of Extinction, though Edge of Extinction itself was a pretty bad performance from her, even though, again, pretty screwed, had a massive target on her back, but I don't think she plays it particularly well anyway. So I think because of that, she would have been knocked off the contender list, to where she wouldn't be as much in the conversation. Also, we got David Wright, who, again, has a very impressive appearance on Miller's Version X, again, was 1 challenge away from winning in unanimous fashion. And I think his Edge of Extinction game is also somewhat impressive. Again, the fact that he had such a big target on his back and was able to still get as far as he did is pretty decent. However, I do think Wentworth still outplays him for most of that season, and just in general, I don't look at David Wright as consistent a player as Wentworth, to where, again, if Wentworth's not making the top 10, David Wright's not making the top 10. So again, he didn't make it on. Finally, we have IOI, where one person from that season did make the list. The only person I would consider is Lauren, who, again, I think plays a very impressive game on this season, but again, like all the other non-winners, it just would be very difficult to justify her being a top 10 player at this current point. With that, again, now we're at the actual top 10, where most of this list, again, is relatively similar. Again, there are 4 changes to this list out of 10, which again is not that much in the grand scheme of things, but again, I still felt like this was a necessary video to kind of wrap up this series. And again, there's still some changes along the way anyway, and we're starting off with one of those changes, again, at number 10, a new addition to this list, a player that, again, would have been very much on the edge, as I mentioned before, but at 10, I do have Wendell Holland from Ghost Island. And Wendell is an interesting player at this point, in the sense that obviously he has his 1 appearance on Ghost Island, where he barely squeaks out the win. Again, it's a very rocky win, where, again, I do think Dominic runs the game more so than Wendell, and while Wendell is definitely involved in things, I think Dominic has more of the hands on the steering wheel, but again, Wendell does play a still impressive game. An issue is obviously the fact that he gets the Dominic and barely squeaks out the win, but also the fact that he does squeak out the win is impressive. Now, I do think he wins from, like, the vote of Angela, which is very rocky, but still, I think he gets to the end, wins against his toughest competition, and again, in comparison to someone like Natalie Anderson, which I mentioned earlier. Natalie wanted to go to the end of Jeremy despite thinking that Jeremy was the biggest jury threat. Wendell is in a bit of a different situation. While he does get to the end with Dominic, who can be perceived as his biggest jury threat, one, Wendell does beat him, where I feel pretty confident that Jeremy would have beaten Natalie. Well, also, Wendell didn't have that much of a choice. Now, technically, he could have made a move against Dominic at 6, yet I can understand why he doesn't make the move. And even beyond that, he technically wanted Dominic out at 4 anyway, to where it's not like he was ever intending on going to the end of Dominic, and still, even then, guaranteed he would get specific votes against Dominic, to where, again, I think it's a better situation than Natalie. Personally, I do think he plays more optimally for a lot more of the game, in my eyes. I think that aspect of his game was a bit more intentional from his point of view. While also, I think at this point, I would have been pretty confident in Wendell as a player. I think I would have looked at him as a very solid all-around player, obviously a very physical player that won challenges at specific points. He's also a very good social player, where we see him win specifically due to his social game with specific people on the jury. Also, strategically, again, I think he's also a very competent player. While a bit more under the radar, I think he does have a very solid strategic mind and was very aware of his position in the game, to where, again, I think there's just a lot to like from Wendell, to where, again, at this point, again, when looking at him as a player and assessing him in most given situations, I would have a lot of faith in him. Again, he was someone that I actually had as my winner pick coming into this season. I felt very good about Wendell preseason. To see him essentially live up to that and playing the exact style of game that I was expecting him to play, again, I think it really solidified some pretty high hopes for Wendell. So again, I had him in high regard, coming into Winners at War. In general, again, I think Wendell is a player that I do still, even now, after Winners at War, have some faith in. Again, my opinion has gone down on him slightly through Winners at War, but again, I still think there's a lot to like from Wendell. He's still a very well-rounded player in my eyes. So while, again, he's barely cracking the top 10, I still feel like he's a player that felt well-rounded enough to where it kind of overcame his little missteps along the way, which is why he's here at number 10. Now, number 9, and again, at this point, we're getting to some of the same placements, so we'll still talk through them briefly. At number 9, we do have Yul from Sorare Cook Islands, which again stays the same, just obviously down a few spots due to later additions to the list. Where again, at this point, I don't think my opinion would have really changed that much. I would have also looked at Yul as a pretty competent all-around player. Well, maybe not as social as someone like Wendell. I think he's someone that really excels strategically, while also having, again, a bit more of an overtly impressive winning game, to where again he was a bit more out in front, and through that I think showed this like leadership ability, to where Wendell kind of played this more under radar game, which to be fair, I mean, maybe as a player I maybe should assess Wendell higher for playing an under radar game, which I do think might be more effective more of the time. Yeah, I think Yul is probably someone that will dictate his position in the game more often, to where, again, I think it is pretty close between Wendell and Yul. I think they are similar players, but like on the opposite side of the spectrum, where again, I think Wendell, again, is strategic, but definitely is a lot more social, while I feel like Yul, again, has good social bonds, but definitely is a lot more strategic, and both of them, again, faced off against their strongest opponent and beat them at the very end. Again, I think it's very close between the two, and again, I can definitely see a world where like Yul is looked at as a more threatening figure than someone like Wendell is in any given season, but I do feel like I would just have so much faith in Yul's strategic ability where it kind of usurps Wendell's placement on this list, being here number 9. Now, number 8, again, same person, same placement. We have Tom Westman, and just down some spots because of the other inclusions. I think Tom Westman, again, still, I would have some question marks on Tom Westman as a player. I do think there are points where I do think his winning game is one that he's greatly benefited by how Palau played out, with Tribe just winning all the challenges and him just winning all the immunities. But again, I think he still demonstrates himself to be a very well-rounded player, obviously being extremely strong physically, having some good social bonds, though probably not as good socially as really both Yul or Wendell, while again being a pretty cutthroat strategic player, where again I think Tom is again in a similar ballpark as Yul and Wendell, though again very much exceeds in the physical portion of the game, but I still think does have the social and strategic aspects as well. Again, not as strong strategically as Yul or as strong socially as Wendell, but still I think competent enough to where, mixing that and the fact that we did see him play for a second time with a massive target on his back and playing decently from the bottom in Heroes vs. Villains, I do feel like, again, it would have been barely enough to be better than Yul and Wendell, to where, and they're all around the same ballpark at this point, but again, it's enough to put Tom here at number 8. Now, number 7, we're moving on to a player that, again, also I hold this person in high regard. This is a person that plays a more impressive game than any of the people we talked about so far, even though I think on paper being on a similar level as a player, though I think the impressiveness of their winning game is what escalates them higher. And at number 7, I do have Earl Cole, who again is in a still very similar spot on the list, but I do think Earl is in this spot where he plays one of the most impressive winning games of all time, despite the fact that he doesn't know anything about Survivor when he plays that game, which makes that game even more impressive, where he controls things from the very beginning, has no difficulty in navigating through the game, is never targeted, is brilliantly positioned, all while facing adversity from the fact that he is on the original Have-Nots tribe. And again, there's a lot to like from Earl. And to be honest, I think he's very close to the number 6 placement on the list. I think they are essentially back and forth. I think there is a serious debate between the two. Yeah, for me, I think the reason why I do have him below the number 6 person is because I think the number 6 person faced a lot more inherent adversity. I think that person was in situations where the game format just very much screwed that person over, yet they were able to overcome that. While I feel like with Earl, despite the fact that, again, he was on the Have-Nots tribe, that's not really a thing that affected his positioning in the game while on that specific tribe. And when he left that tribe, I think he's very much benefited from the fact that the players were able to talk before the tribes were decided, which is something that doesn't necessarily happen on every season. To where, again, I think Earl was benefited by certain aspects of this format. Where while I think he's still a very impressive player, I do feel like in comparison to the number 6 person, while they are somewhat similar, I feel like that number 6 person had more impressive feats of overcoming adversity, to where that's why Earl is here at number 7. Now, number 6, we have one of the new additions to the list. It's being the most recent person to be added to this top 10 here, and that person is Tommy Sheehan from IOI. And again, I've always been a big proponent of Tommy's game. I've talked to him pretty highly in all my top player rankings. And again, same thing here. I think Tommy's game is very impressive, specifically from a player perspective, where I think through his one specific season, he's able to demonstrate him playing from the top and bottom. He's able to do so while also not really being at blame for why he's at the bottom. He gets in very unlucky circumstances and is still able to overcome that adversity. Again, the fact that he gets completely swap screwed at split tribal twist and should be in this position where he is a dead man walking and is still able to get through that position, which, I mean, obviously you can call him that's because of the poor play from Missy. I still think there is good play from Tommy to get a lane to want to keep him around to begin with. And also we get him being unlucky and him losing Jason due to a vote blocker. Yeah, I still think he does pretty good work and repairing his relationships after that. His SWAT tribe ends up coming into the merge with the numbers and sticks true to that. And beyond that, he does very good work in pulling over Dean and again is able to trick Nora into taking out Lauren for him. And obviously the expulsion of Dan makes him face off more adversity in the back portion of the season, him having to barely squeak out the win and taking out Janet and Lauren much later than he was planning on, where again, I think there's a lot of adversity that Tommy faces and he's still able to overcome that while also playing an extremely dominant game the entire time, coming off as a very well-rounded player, being extremely strong socially, while also being very strong strategically, being able to keep around all of his allies and take them to the end of the game in a spot where they are more loyal to him than they are to others. Again, something that is so impressive about his game is him undermining Lauren throughout most of the game and having Lauren take out her own numbers for the sake of keeping Tommy's numbers. Also, he's someone that, again, is physical. Now, he doesn't win any challenges, yet he does claim post-show that he was throwing the majority of those challenges. So again, I think that's kind of a wash there. But again, as a whole, I think Tommy just comes off as a pretty well-rounded player that faced off against a lot of adversity and despite that played a pretty dominant game and was able to overcome all that adversity, where I think he comes off as a very impressive player for a one-time player, nearly as impressive as you can be for a one-time player, with him having to play such a flexible game in his one appearance, which is why he's here at number 6. Now number 5, and at number 5, we're moving on to a player that played for their second time in a time since the last video, had a pretty impressive win, and that really escalated my opinion of them as a player. And at number 5, we do have Jeremy Collins, who obviously in this time frame had won on Survivor Cambodia. So he's a new addition to this list, as obviously he wasn't here from his San Juan del Sur appearance, but this is also before his appearance on Winners at War. And again, through that, he ends up, again, becoming a pretty highly rated winner here. I do look at Jeremy as a very impressive winner. Again, the fact that he won on Cambodia, a very competitive season, one of the most strategically savvy casts in the history of the show, one of the most aggressive casts in the history of the show. The fact that he was able to overcome that and go on to win that season, I think is very impressive, despite some flaws in his game. Now, obviously, this is not the fully formed Jeremy Collins that we have now, where we don't see his appearance on Winners at War through this ranking, though to be honest, it doesn't really change much. I feel like Jeremy's actually a player that through Winners at War, I feel like I didn't really get much new from Jeremy. I feel like we kind of saw the same Jeremy that I kind of expected from him, to where while it wasn't a great run for him, it wasn't one that really knocked him much in terms of his placement on the list, where again, his Cambodia appearance was kind of enough to really solidify him this high, where he again has this strategy of utilizing meat shields and was able to really effectively utilize that strategy while also having a lot of influence in the game, again, facing adversity at points and still able to overcome that, to where despite the fact that he was on the bottom at certain points on that season, he's still able to get back in the majority following rounds, specifically due to his really really great connections to the likes of Spencer and Tasha. After all, again, he showed himself to have some pretty bad reads at points, and I would still worry about his overall target. In most given seasons, he still demonstrated himself as someone that's adaptable to the game, someone that was able to pick up on the game after Wendell and learn from his mistakes there, to where, again, I think it would have shown himself as a flexible enough player here, with him also just being kind of well-rounded and being a cutthroat enough player, a strategically savvy enough player, a very good social player, and again, one that can win challenges, where again, it's enough to put Jeremy here at number 5. Now number 4, moving on to a player that, obviously, again, nothing has really changed with this player since the last video. He hadn't played again, nothing's really changed. That person's Boston Rob. Now again, Boston Rob at this point is above Jeremy. He technically goes below Jeremy after Winners at War, and I'll probably still stick by that. I think Winners at War, while it was a, again, appearance that had him being kind of screwed over, he didn't really have much of a shot coming in that season. I do feel like he showed some lack of adaptability on that season that kind of knocked him a bit, to where I think without that in mind, I do think I would have him above Jeremy at this point, where I think his winning game obviously was a lot more flawless than Jeremy's. After all, obviously the level of difficulty of this win is not as high as Jeremy's. I do think the level of control he had throughout the entire season is very more impressive. Well, also beyond that, obviously he has 2 final appearances at this point. He got to the end All-Stars, he obviously won Redemption Island, to where, I mean, his appearances and Marquesas and Here's Villains are not that far apart from Jeremy's appearance in San Juan del Sur. So essentially, like at this point, I do think I would have looked at Austin Robb as essentially a Jeremy Collins that just played more time. I would have looked at them as similar players. While Jeremy, again, was effectively able to utilize the meat shield strategy and had a bit more win equity on Cambodia than Rob had on either of his seasons where he got to the end. I do think the fact that Rob was able to do it twice and had a more impressive win is, again, something that definitely excels him over Jeremy at this point. To where I think through his appearance on Winners at War, I would have knocked him a bit there, but I think at this current point, I think he just feels like, again, a slightly better version than Jeremy, which is why he's here number 4. Now number 3, the last change on this list is a player that, again, played another time since Survivor Cambodia, this being a player that had now played 4 times and just continued this stretch of having another somewhat impressive game despite a massive target on her back, and that person is Cirie Fields, where obviously in this time she had played Survivor Game Changers, where, again, if this was before Game Changers, in my assessment of her there, again, she would be lower on this list. She'd be closer to where Earl is on this list. Yeah, I do think after Game Changers, again, it demonstrated once again her being able to overcome adversity, her being on the bottom and able to overcome that. Now, again, if she did go to Tribal at the first Tribal, she probably does go home. And straight up, she doesn't go to Tribal before the merge, which obviously helps her. But still, I think she's able to recover from that pretty well. Again, she comes to the merge in a pretty solid position, essentially being this main decision maker on who goes home between Michaela and Haley and able to get her way there. She is on the outs during the Oz Evo, but again, is able to bring back the majority after that. Again, having this allegiance with Andrea and Michaela and Aubrey, and being able to pull in Zeke and Sarah, and again, essentially run the show for a few votes. Now, again, I think Sarah's in more power position throughout a lot of that, but again, the fact that Cirie came into that season with a massive target on her back and she's able to still maintain that much power is very impressive. And while, again, her game does crumble towards the end of that, and she has the misstep with the vote steal, she still comes to the final 6 in a spot where she almost pulls off a 3-2-1 in taking Sarah out. So obviously all the advantages come into play and she gets advantage getting out of the game. And again, that's not great. I think it's something to praise from her in the sense that, again, she didn't get naturally voted out here. Though, I will be honest, I do think the level of praise people give to her Game Changers game is a bit overblown. Again, as much as I just praised her right there, and I think there's a lot of impressive things to have from it, I do think it's a spot where she wasn't going to win anyway. I think a lot of people assume that, oh, she survived advantage again, she won the game, where again, she had like Aubrey and Ty with her and they were going to run the show and she was just going to win, when in reality, that was just never really going to happen. I feel like Cirie was very clearly the biggest target at that point, with everyone knowing how she would win if she got to the end, where I would be mind blown if Cirie somehow navigates through the next 2 votes without being voted out. In that spot where I think more than likely the most likely outcome is probably just a Ty, Brad, Troyzan final 3, if Ty probably winning in that spot, to where I just think Cirie is in a spot where it's pretty difficult for her to actually pull off the win at that point, where again, like theoretically, if Sarah does go home in that spot, I think looking at who's left in the game, I actually think Cirie is probably the least likely to actually make it to the end of the people there, just because I don't think anybody takes Cirie to the end, knowing how big of a jury threat she is. But still, it's still a spot where she plays a very impressive game and is able to demonstrate once again her playing another impressive game by having this massive target on her back. Again, Cirie is someone that, again, was extremely high already. Again, she played 2 very impressive games at the beginning of her career. A Panama game that, again, definitely has some qualms with, but still, again, probably the best player of that season, comes back from Micronesia and then essentially gets screwed out of a win, where had there been a final three, she more than likely wins. Not a guarantee. I do think it would have been a very close vote. Yeah, again, I do think Cirie would have likely won in that position. So again, she then gets screwed over in Heroes vs. Villains by an idol play and some pre-game stuff, to where, again, the fact that she comes back for Game Change again, gets advantage getting out of the game, spot where she has never been properly voted out of the game through natural means, is a pretty insane thing for a 4-time player, and a 4-time player that had made it towards the end game 3 of those times, to where I think this level of consistency we've seen from Cirie, and the fact that she hasn't been able to be taken out due to natural means, is just so impressive from her, to where, and she's the only non-winner in the top 10 here. Yeah, I do think that specifically is something that really escalates her on the list here, again, above the likes of Boss Rob, above the likes of Jeremy, with her adding to her consistency and also, again, just demonstrating some more pretty solid play throughout all this, where, again, because of that, Cirie lands here number 3 now. Now, number 2, and again, the top 2 are the same. I mean, there's not really that much to run through. It's nothing really changes my opinions of these players over this time period, but we'll still run through it anyway. At number 2, I do have Parvati Shallow. Again, same thing. I think in the comparison to Cirie, I think it's tough to really have Cirie above Parvati, particularly due to the fact that, again, Parvati has that win that Cirie doesn't have. Now, again, technically, obviously, if the final 3 in Micronesia did happen, Cirie would have potentially beaten Parvati at the end. And through that would be this very clear thing to have Cirie higher than Parvati for. But that didn't happen, and we don't fully know what would happen there. So, again, when we're looking at, again, the 2 seasons that they were on together, we do have Parvati, again, technically beating her in Micronesia, but also, again, very much outlasting her on Heroes vs. Villains, where, again, both of them had these massive targets on their back, and, again, Cirie was not able to avoid hers, while Parvati was, and able to make it all the way to the end. Also, again, that does mean that Parvati's made it to Final Tribal twice, in a spot where Cirie has not been able to make it once. Also, Parvati's in a spot where she was kind of screwed over by some of the twists involved in Cook Islands, where if that had been the case and the White Alliance had gotten to the merge of the numbers, she very likely wins that season. So again, like when we're looking at Parvati before Winners at War in particular, I think when we're looking at their runs, I think Parvati just has a better track record. To where while I think Cirie definitely demonstrates a lot more agency in her games and a lot more impressive strategic ability through her appearances, I feel like Parvati outlasts Cirie in the 2 times that they played together. And also has like a pretty equal season, her being kind of screwed over due to a twist that would have potentially led to her win in Cook Islands, while also not having an early boot yet in the way that Cirie does. So I really think as a whole, again, at this point, I don't think there's much of a justification for Parvati being below Cirie, outside the potential of Cirie beating her in the final 3 and Micronesia, which is just not secure enough to where, again, because I do have Parvati above her here at number 2. And at number 1, again, nothing really changed with this, but at number 1, we have Kim Spradlin. Again, still would be the best player of all time to me at this current point. I remember, again, I specifically know I had Kim Spradlin as the best player of all time coming into Winners at War. And again, nothing really changes. Again, I think she has the most dominant appearance in the history of the show. I think she also comes off as an extremely well-rounded player. Someone that is, again, very good at challenges. Again, ties the record for most challenge wins by a woman. She also was very good socially, and the fact that she had extremely close bonds to the majority of the people on this season, where the only person she wasn't able to gel with at all is Leaf, and even outside that, and had close bonds to pretty much everyone within the women's alliance, and even then had a good bond with Troyzan before he got bitter, and had a bond with even Michael Jefferson and Jay. And again, she does have these really good social bonds where everyone within her alliance wanted to take her to the end, and also strategically, again, had this cutthroat enough ability to navigate through the game in a way that had her taking out those that she thought was a threat to her, and her being able to have that agency and controlling those votes. To where, while I think you can definitely qualm with the fact that she doesn't betray Sabrina and Chelsea, who are these bigger jury threats, and does take them to the end, it's still a spot where, again, she beats them anyway. And we also have her, again, organizing the women against the men earlier on, and again, doing the active work and tricking Troyzan to take out Michael Jefferson. Where, again, I think there's a lot of good strategic ability there. And obviously, there is still the issue of her being a one-time player, and we obviously have these other people that have played numerous times higher on the list. Again, literally every other person that's towards the top of this list outside Kim is someone that had played numerous times. Again, we have Parvati, Cirie, Bostrop, Jeremy, all people that have played multiple times on Survivor, to where I think there is, again, a potential qualm of why is Kim at the top when we have all these other people that have more experience and more of a resume. But again, I just really do feel like Kim's winning game is literally that perfect. I would have just so much faith in her in any given season. To where, again, I can point out issues with Parvati, I can point out issues with Cirie, I can point out issues with Rob, I can point out issues with Jeremy. At this current point in Survivor, 4 Winners at War, I cannot point out a flaw with Kim. Based on what we were shown on the show, Kim plays a perfect game and comes off as a perfect player, to where, again, there's not really a justification for me for her not being number one, outside the fact that, again, there's just not enough of her. But again, at this current point, I just feel like the other players towards the top just have enough flaws to where I could still justify this placement. So again, Kim is here number one. But there we go. I mean, again, that's the final top 10 player video based on a specific point in Survivor history, because obviously we've caught up at this point. So again, after Winners at War, I obviously did my original list. So again, if you want to see what the updated ranking was after that, again, you can watch that video. And you might question, again, when am I going to redo that video? When I'm going to show who my top 10 is nowadays? Straight up, I mean, there's not that much changes after Winners at War. I mean, we're at the point now where all we've had are newbie seasons, where while again, you can maybe argue a couple people from these more recent seasons, I mean, after Winners at War, my top 10 becomes extremely solidified to where outside of the like last couple placements on the list, like everyone else there is pretty solidified in their spots to where, again, there's not much room to make the top 10 at this point. So I'm not sure when I'll ever update my top 10 necessarily. However, I will be updating my ranking in general at some point where, again, I've said this in the past, I will be ranking every player of Survivor at some point down the road, more than likely after Survivor 50. So stay tuned for that whenever that comes, which will be a ridiculous undertaking. But again, that'll probably be the next time you see a updated top 10 of some sort. So again, stay tuned for whenever that comes. But till then, obviously just expect more of the same style of content. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.